with a mic. So hi everyone. Thank you for welcoming me in your course or seminar. I'll be talking about the social ecology of capital. I've got a PowerPoint that is that has more stuff that I'm going to say. So if ever you find what I'm saying less interesting, then just read the PowerPoint. But I won't read through the whole PowerPoint. You'll see as I move along through it. The presentation I'm doing today is based on a book I wrote in 2023. Well, it was published in 2023. In this book, I wanted to do one main thing, and I'll get back to it in a second in more detail. But the idea was, how could, from a political economy point of view, I come from regulation theory, Robert Boyer, Aglietta, that type of, and post-Keynesian economics. So how could one take that framework and bring into that framework, or couple that framework with MIFA analysis, material energy flow analysis, which I'll be presenting today. That was the challenge in the book, and if you've read the paper that's from the book, or if you've read the book itself, you'll see that that's what I'm working towards, with an overarching question, which was, what does capitalist growth mean materially, and how can we analyze the contradictions of capitalism from a biophysical point of view? And I'll talk about that in a few seconds. So in today's presentation, I'm going to start by presenting the Vienna social ecology framework, and in general, the approach, why they developed that approach, then dive into the model, the linear throughput model, its implications, how we can develop from this model an analysis of the social structures of capitalist metabolism. I'll explain what that means, capitalist metabolism, and end with some opening questions, and then we can have the discussion with the presentations that will follow. All right, so let's get the slides running, and and there are a few pictures so Canada is, of course, we're part of the OECD, we're part of the G7, so we're considered these developed economies, but we also are massively dependent on extraction. This is a gold mine about 700 kilometers north of Montreal. The students in my master's program, which is an interdisciplinary master's program in environmental sciences, visit this mine to understand what extraction really is. These down here are massively huge trucks, about 3 times the size of this classroom. And you can see how the scale question is very... and the amount of mineral that is worth something taken out of this mine wouldn't even fill this classroom. So we have to build this big hole just to get something about half the size of this classroom of gold. So, and then the second picture I have, so that's extraction, and then we'll be talking a lot about this. And then this is the other end of the process. To have aluminum, you have to transform bauxite, and when you transform bauxite, you end up with tailings from the transformation process. This is not tied to the mine. This is where, so we mine the bauxite in Brazil or in Guinea, and then we put it on a boat, and the bauxite comes to Quebec. Why? Because we have cheap hydropower. To create aluminum, it takes massive amounts of power. It's a very energy-intensive process, and you end up with a lot of garbage. And these are tailing ponds just outside of the factory. This is taken from Google Earth, so you can see the tailing ponds from Google Earth. And this tailing area that has been filled in the last 30 years is full, and now this forested part here, which is used by the workers that work in the factory as a place to go jogging and hiking and skiing, cross-country skiing in winter, is the next space that we're going to totally bulldoze to be able to put the new tailings. So this is dissipation. When I talk about social dissipation, this is the scale at which it takes so that we can have aluminum to have these nice shiny computers that we use. The ecology of societies, how Vienna has approached this problem. So the Vienna Institute of Social Ecology, its particular approach to the linear throughput, and 3, the specific metabolism of capitalist societies. Let's go through this. So why did I embark on this analysis of social ecology? Why was it important for me? It was to answer 2 questions. I talked about them before, but I'll be more specific. The first was that there has been a huge development in the natural sciences of the environment in the last 30 years. And the main And you've probably seen the graph of planetary boundaries. You probably know that by heart, the 9 boundaries. So to be able to create that iconic graphic, behind that is a huge evolution in the Earth system sciences, where the Earth system is seen now as an integrated whole through biogeochemical cycles, driven mainly by life processes. As life has developed on Earth, it has totally subsumed the geological processes and meshed them together into these very complex biogeochemical processes. So this has been developed in the natural sciences, and the problem that I had as an economist was that I couldn't connect to this. I couldn't take my concepts and I couldn't couple them to these processes, even though what we call climate change, biodiversity loss, saturation of waters and mostly waters through eutrophisation of waters through phosphorus or nitrogen, these biophysical facts are tied to economic processes, farming and in fossil fuel driven industry, fossil fuel driven lifestyles. So I had to be able to connect, and social ecology for me is a way to analytically connect economic processes with these natural processes without reducing one to the other, which is often the problem we have. Either we go all in constructivism and say this whole thing is just, mental process, or we're on the other end, we do biophysical reductionism, and then we just forget that human societies have specific properties and specific forms of causality. So this brings me to the first epistemological principle of social ecology: independent areas of causality that intermediate each other. So we have natural causality, we have social causality, socioeconomic causality. We don't reduce one to the other, but we understand that they are connected, they are coupled. It's a concept we all work with, they are coupled. And I'll show you in a second one concrete example of this coupling. So that's the first reason. The second reason was, well, to provide an answer to a question: why are our economic theories unecological? And this is not normative. This is not a normative principle. This is an analytical principle. If you've done economics, you'll see that nature is just something out there. It's an externality, we call it. It only comes in through a monetary price signal. There is no causal or analytical equipment to bring nature in. Our models are, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, our models don't have nature in them, don't have ecological processes. Our models, or when they do, it's because we put a price tag on some part of nature. So through MIFA, which is material and energy flow analysis, we are able to have a representation of the economy as a biophysical system, and we are able to analyze economic processes through a language that is not monetary, that is in physical units, tons and joules. And this was the major breakthrough of the Vienna School of Social Ecology, was to be able to say, can we model biophysical processes in a language that is not monetary, but that has some biophysical consistency. And this, there's a breakthrough paper, which is this one here. Marina Fischer-Kowalski and Helmut Haber write this paper it was published in 1997, but it goes back to the early 1990s. Marina is a sociologist, political economist, and Helmut is a biologist. And together they write this paper, Tons, Joules, and Money, Modes of Production and Their Sustainability Problems, which was you always have to have some little relevant tidbit part in your title. So that's to make it relevant back in those days when sustainability was the big word. But that's where this language of social ecology is. So that's, I guess, the reason why I turned to social ecology. So now let's go into the theory. The theory starts with a basic segmentation in ecological analysis. So I want to answer right away the question, why social ecology? We literally are trying to describe the ecological relations of societies. So that's what, I mean, it's not more mysterious than that. How can we do an ecology not of human beings, but of social processes? What are the ecological relations that are articulated to society? And for us, society, well, mainly the structures that we have are reproduced by the economy. So we talk about socioeconomic, the relations of socioeconomic systems. These ecological relations, and here we take a classification that comes from way back in the 50s in ecological sciences. We either have synecology or autoecology. This synecology is basically the relations of living beings amongst themselves in a given habitat, how they construct relations. And out of these relations, you have an ecosystem. This has been analyzed through the paradigm of colonization, how human societies colonize ecosystems and transform them, bring them out of equilibrium and maintain them out of equilibrium. The second, and this is what we'll be doing today, the second grand field of inquiry is the autoecological processes, which is basically the relationship between one species and its habitat. So it's not a relations between species, but one species and its habitat in its biotic and abiotic dimensions. And this is the model which we use to build up social metabolism. So the species that we're looking at is society, and we're looking at how societies relate to its natural environment through material flows, and that's the basic model that we've developed. And it's also, and this is important, it's a materialist analysis, meaning in this sense, materialist meaning biophysical systems, and we use mainly quantitative methods. We're interested in mass flows and mass quantities. We'll get to that. Okay, so that's the book that I wrote. It builds on this book. Let's start with the first concept, the linear throughput. It's right up here, this drawing up here. Basically, this can be said of any society, and this is, I guess, an important epistemological remark. The language of social metabolism is mainly the language of industrial societies. Of course, we can use this language to describe agrarian or hunter-gatherer societies, but doing that, we're using a language that is alien to their own ways of conceiving themselves and their relationship to their living and non-living environments. So in one sense, doing that implies some kind of epistemological violence, because we're taking our concepts and putting them, using concepts really alien to their ways of being. But still, it can be done, and I'll be doing it. I'll be doing it for reasons of comparative analysis. It's sometimes interesting to look at this. But so getting back to the basic model says that for a society to exist, it exists by the means of a material throughput. The throughput is different from the input and the output you understand in economics. The output is Y yield. It can be the GDP output, whatever. That's the amount of goods and services a society creates to sustain itself. And then your inputs, your inputs are internal to the economy. It's labor, land. So land is usually ditch aside land, saying too complicated. We'll just take labor and capital. That's all, and work with that. And sometimes you use land, but land is not a biophysical. Often not a biophysical. It's just an area. It's very abstract. Here, the model is different. We're not interested in the output. We're interested in the throughput, the amount of matter or energy that flows through societies, and this flow through is necessary to maintain and reproduce their structures. Like this building we're in, the computer, my voice right now is able to come to you through energy and matter. So this is what the throughput, and I'll give you concrete measures of that. This throughput must be extracted from environments we call nature in some form. And the throughput, because of the first law of thermodynamics, which is really central to the model, the first law of thermodynamics says basically that nothing is created, nothing is destroyed, everything is just transformed. So you have the mass balance principle, that what you extract at one end will inevitably be dissipated at the other end. It won't disappear. That's the first principle. And the second principle is this flow-through process is entropic, in the sense that any material transformation implies in some form or another a degradation of what is flowing through. The model of entropy is, of course, for energy. Some ecological economists have transposed the idea of entropy applied to energy systems, have applied it to matter, but when I do that, physicists or engineers will get really pissed off and say, you can't do that. Matter is not entropic. Okay, matter is not entropic, but as you successively transform matter, it does degrade through three, so we call this social dissipation of matter. It either degrades through dissipation. As we walked into the CNAM earlier, I walked in around, so there was still salt on the ground. That salt was put there by a human being. It was extracted somewhere. We have huge salt mines in Quebec for this type of, because we have ice, a lot more ice and snow than you guys have. But still, so this salt was extracted from some environment, and it's put down, and basically it just has a chemical reaction and of dissolution. And this dissolution, well, you could try to scrape up the liquid, and then you could evaporate it, and you might get the salt back. You probably lose some that just went in the gutter, went in the sewer. So you'll never get back all that you put in the ground. That's the first principle. It's not entropy, but it still is some form of dissipation. The second one is that as we transform matter, we corrupt them. Iron will rust. And then the third one is we contaminate matter a lot. And especially modern societies compared to 20, 30 years ago, the materials we use in our contemporary societies are very complex materials of geological origin. And these materials, with our industrial processes today, we can combine them, but economically speaking, we can't divide them. And the easiest example is a bag of chips. Take a bag of chips, it mixes plastic and metal, and we can't economically separate these two materials. So it's basically lost to humanity until maybe in urban mining in 3,000 years, we'll have figured out a way to get these things separated. But today we don't. Just throw them away, bury them, hope they disappear. They don't. They just stay there. So matter, as matter flows through and performs work for society, it degrades. So this is the linear throughput. And the basic idea for capitalism and for our societies and for economic analysis is that if we have mass production and we have mass consumption, then we have mass extraction, and we have mass dissipation. And unfortunately, economists have not paid attention to the two ends of the process. We don't have robust economic theories of mass dissipation and of mass extraction. And that's, I would say, the scientific challenge of today, to develop these theories. Okay, that's I guess the first thing. I'm looking here at oh yeah, and I'll get to that in a second. But it is through this flow of materials that our practices, our economic practices, are structurally articulated or embedded in geochemical cycles. And the easiest one is the carbon cycle. We all know how the carbon cycle works. And what we've been doing for the past 200 years is basically accelerating it. We've tapped into a source of carbon that is a flow. I mean, the oil, coal, and gas is a flow. It's a very, very, very slow flow. This matter was accumulated for millions, hundreds of millions of years in the Earth's crust. It was transformed. And every given year, some of it was coming out. Either you had gas emissions coming out of certain areas, rock formations. You would have oil seepage into rivers, you would have coal coming up the Earth's surface and then just eroding and going back to the seabed. So that did exist. You did have a very, very slow cycle of hydrocarbons. What we've done is in the last 200 years, we've compressed that cycle that was over hundreds of millions of years into a cycle that is in 200 years. And then, the Earth system cycles reacted. They're trying to deal with all this carbon that we're shooting up. So basically accelerating this cycle. Accelerating geological time. We've been able to do that. It's kind of weird. So this is a concrete example of this embeddedness. And then the last idea, which is I guess the most important. Have you guys read Karl Polanyi at all? Yeah. Okay. So I've been using this concept of economic process since the beginning. So as you know, the economic process is defined by its embeddedness in social structures. So the only thing I'm doing, and I could just stop the conference here, is I'm saying we need a dual embeddedness, not only in social structures, but in ecological processes. End of story. But I'll go on. to explain how this embeddedness works. So then we have to finally say that these flows that we're measuring, looking at, we don't look at them like engineers, because we know that these flows are governed by instituted processes. There's institutions that govern the metabolic flow, and that's what the analysis is all about, how to understand these. So when we say that, it's fun, you should reread the definition of the economic process by Polanyi. It's really interesting because he takes the time to explain that from his point of view, what the economy is made up of flows, that things circulate. And he says this circulation is in social structures. And it's easy to have a very simplistic view of what he understands by circulation, to think that the thing is moving around. And then when you look at this graph, you might say, well, Eric is talking about things moving around. Not only am I talking about things moving around physically, I'm talking about things moving around in institutional processes, in frameworks, frameworks of meaning. So the thing might not be moving, but it might be moving physically, but it might be moving in meaning structures, and thus it might be shifting from something that is throughput inside society to waste. When we decide to throw something away, if I take this paper and I put it there, it's not moving very far, but socially it's gone from consumption to waste, which is a huge move. So you have to understand the circulation of the throughput as a series of metamorphoses of form, from raw materials to use values to waste forms. And this movement is not a physical movement, it's a movement inside economic structures. And I guess that's the most important thing, I guess. And then we have to work with these concepts to operationalize them, to be able to measure this mass flow, because if it's a mass flow, then it's a quantity. We've divided society's metabolism in 4 big categories, which really only make sense from the point of view of an industrial society. If you're in an agrarian or hunter-gatherer society, does somebody have to sign? David, I think you have to sign a form. That's okay. So we basically boil everything down to 4 flow forms. I'll start with the bottom and go up. Biomass, so we take everything that is from organic processes, everything that is the result of ecological processes, living beings, and we call that biomass. And we can measure that, and I'll show you. We have fossil fuels we put apart because it's the main energy form of industrial societies. Metals, and then we lumped all the rest into a big category called non-metallic minerals. You'd think that's a lot of stuff, and in terms of qualitatively, yes, it's very diverse. The salt that was on the sidewalk goes into that category, but actually most of it, 99% of it, is one thing: sand. And why sand? Because concrete. And our societies materially are mostly made up of concrete. That's the biggest flow of all, and thus it's the biggest amount in that category. Okay, I think you've heard Julie de Lannoy. Lannoy, yeah. Yeah, Julia, yeah. So a lot of what I'm presenting is like Julie's stuff. Actually, I know her pretty well, actually. Okay, so we have so we have now biophysical accounts for most economies. So you can couple this to macroeconomic analysis. If you go to the UNEP's resource panel database, you can extract the data going back to the 70s, and you can have access to databases from other researchers. You can go back to 100 to 150 years for most economies. So we've divided up this flow into 3 great categories: material extraction, which I'll be talking about the most; material consumption. So you can extract but not consume. Quebec does that a lot. Canada does that a lot. We extract stuff and ship it elsewhere. We ship our oil to the Americans. We ship our steel to the Americans. We ship our wood to Europe. So we have what we call an export constraint. We can't absorb in our metabolism what we extract. So a lot of what we extract goes elsewhere. So you can calculate imports and exports. And then finally, processed output, which is the wasting process. So once something is used up, it basically is just called processed output. And here's a first general idea of how we count this stuff. So you have our 4 great categories here. This is the global material throughput from 1970 to 223. I stopped. 224. We went up 1 gigaton, so it's 105 gigatons. So 104 gigatons of matter. That's kind of a big number, but what does it mean really? Well, if you take all the net primary production on Earth, on terrestrial, not forget the waters, just take terrestrial net primary production. That's everything that the plants transform through photosynthesis, and it is embodied in them. So their growth process. In 1 year, you're about at 120 gigatons of dry matter. So we're approaching in our metabolism about what nature, if we can call it that, produces for itself. So it's kind of a big number. In the 1970s, we were at 31. So we've tripled the amount that we extract. And if you look at what's growing and what's stable, well, everything is growing, first of all. The funny thing is that what's grown the least are biomass and fossil fuels. But fossil fuels is what's grown the least, actually. Because, well, maybe I get that in the Q&A, but one of the answers to that is because we're extracting less coal and more gas, and gas is light. And basically, it's got its masses. But here is the building blocks of industrial society, non-metallic minerals, sand, gravel, cement, basically. So there's one. How can the linear throughput be coupled to Earth system science? Here's an example, phosphorus. So you have up here the growth of the global extraction of agricultural and industrial non-metallic minerals. You got a bunch of things in that, including the salt that was on the sidewalk, but actually most of it is phosphorus. It's the one big thing that we extract with potassium in the industrial agricultural minerals. And you can see the growth process, which is very important, and we can directly tie this to phosphorus ending up in waters and creating these algal blooms. And then we can tie this up to the fact that in our planetary boundaries now, we say we've crossed the boundary in the biogeochemical cycle of phosphorus. So the way we grow things is tied to a way of extracting stuff, and this way of extracting and then growing implies at the other end dissipating and demanding a sink function of the planet. So and that sink function, unfortunately, the soils are not able to perform this sink function of absorbing all this phosphorus. There's just too much of it. So it leaches and ends up in water bodies, and the water bodies, as the ecosystems that are there, that are normally there, that work in a certain equilibrium, are not able to deal with the phosphorus. So what happens is the alga comes in and says, well, we can deal with this, but then the other life forms, unfortunately, cannot live in the environment that the algal blooms create to deal with our phosphorus dissipation. We don't want to throw phosphorus in water. No, we don't do that. We use the phosphorus in our agriculture, but unfortunately, the metabolic process is equivalent to throwing phosphorus in water because most of it ends up there. So that's a very concrete example of how we can work, which brings me to an important idea that extraction and dissipation are boundary functions. They create frontiers of interaction between ecological processes and economic processes. So we have an extractive frontier and we have a dissipative frontier. Our biggest dissipative frontier is climate change. It's the atmosphere trying, and the seas, because the oceans do a lot of work on this too. It's the ocean and the atmosphere trying to deal with all the CO2 we're spewing up there. Okay. How am I doing time-wise? That's good, okay. So matter does not just flow through society, it also accumulates inside society. So that's the second big category. The first big category of metabolic analysis is the throughput, the linear flow from source to sink, knowing that source and extraction are tied together as a frontier, and that dissipation or waste and sink are tied together as a frontier. Okay, so remember this because I'll talk about that later on. So the second big concept is material stocks. So matter does not just accumulate, not just flow through society. matter accumulates in society. There's a bunch of stuff, and I could go on, like I do a 3-hour course on this, usually, just on this one thing, on stocks. So I'll bring it down to just some very simple principles. But the first thing is you have to understand the stock as slowed flows. So this building is flowing. Matter is coming in. We can probably, if we look hard, find patches. Paint's been put on here. We can find patches on the floor. And matter is flowing out. We're using up the material. So you have to see this stock as a flow. It's just a slowed flow. Okay? The second thing is that stocks, and I'll talk about this in a second, have flow effects. They determine the way flows work. But before getting into that, one of the big transformations of modern societies, modern capitalist societies, is that these are stock accumulating societies compared to societies that are more agrarian in nature. And this is, here you have a, so I put a bunch of examples, but this is a great work from Krausman from Vienna, Fridolin, looking at, so it's a percentage, right? It's not an absolute number. Over a century, this is global extraction and looking at the purpose of what is extracted. So do we extract to have stocks or do we extract to have flows? So we cut this up, well they cut this up, and it's something that we often do in different use types of matter. So matter can be used as food, which is down here. Matter can be used as feed. What is feed? Well, feed either feeds food, but that's new, that's here. Feed, before the 1950s, fed animal motors, because we used animals for their work, more than for their food. They're much more important as sources of labor than they are as sources of food before 1950. And then we have our good old, well, coal, oil, and gas. Here it's mostly coal, then oil comes in here, then gas comes in here. The calcium that was on the sidewalk. Everything that is used dissipatively, fertilizers, phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, this is all matter that's just used dissipatively. We extract it and we just spread it around. And then finally, tailings, yeah, mine tailings, because when we extract stuff, there's always rock that's useless, and we just throw that, pile it up somewhere. And then finally, stock building materials. So if you look at this graph, you see a big secular shift from a throughput that is mostly around fast-flowing matter, food, feed, fossil fuels, to, after 1950, 1960, a different society where most of what we're extracting, more than 51%, is actually accumulated matter, which is tied to global urbanization, to suburbanization, to a radical shift. So that's I guess the first thing we can say about material stocks. Why is it not? Yeah, I just, and just to remember, this is something that often is forgotten, but you know, the big reason we had all this feed was not to feed humans. It was because we wanted to extract labor from animals. Okay, now some basic processes that follow from this interaction between stocks and flows. This is from industrial ecology, and we just give it an economic understanding. Stocks flow, I said that. 2, stocks command flows. If we tend to our stocks, if we want to keep these stocks performing certain functions for society, then we have to feed them. The easiest way to understand my argument is these things here. The only way this thing works is if I charge it every day or every 2 days. So this is a stock and it commands a flow. We need electricity. But then think of cars. Think of this room is heated right now. Electricity is coming in. So this is all, every time we build a stock, and especially if this stock is a long living stock because of social institutions. Let's say it's capitalized. It's a machine or it's a factory. Let's say it's capitalized by a household because it's your home. You've got a mortgage on it. then you have a commitment to the long-term existence of that stock in a certain manner. Well, if you have that commitment, you will make sure the flows arrive. You will also, so our institutions work to keep the flows flowing in function of the stocks we have. This means that any discussion around bifurcation, transition, transformation, name it how you want, has to deal with this very basic problem of long-lived stocks that are tied to social institutions, and that those social institutions imply relations of power over the maintenance or the dismantling or the conversion of these material stocks. And just think of the fossil fuel industry, and then, you know, the whole thing is there. So that's stocks that command flows. Very important when we're looking at materially what a transition means. I mean, in North America, the idea, you have a legislation in the EU that by 2035 you have no more internal combustion engines except for German muscle cars. And we can talk about that, why, and Italian muscle cars, Porsches and Lamborghinis, who are supposedly going to have green synthetic fuels, but I don't believe that 1 minute. They're going to have good old-fashioned based oil. But anyway, but you have this legislation in place. In North America, we had it. And in the last 3 years, it's disappeared everywhere. Every government has reneged on this, saying, oh, we won't be able to make it. Why? Because the automobile industry in North America has lobbied hard to get rid of that because they're tied to the fossil fuel industry. They know that if the stock, which is cars, which is huge in terms of mass, if that stock electrifies, then it's the end of their business model, basically. So there's a concrete example of power relations around a stock. Finally, and this is the thing, this is the most obvious one for economists, flows limit stock formation. And of course, scarcity. We're really good at analyzing scarcity, and we have these nice little curves where we show how, you know, as we all know this, you know, we all know this thing here, where the cost at one point of the quantity goes skywards, and that's the end of that. So of course, the thing is, it's more complicated than that, because as we saw with the whole peak oil debate, which personally I never believed in peak oil, at least the way it was presented back about 10 years ago. Well, you know, peak oil was just before. I worked on the tar sands, so I was looking at the peak oil people saying, you guys don't know at all what you're talking about. Come in the tar sands and you'll see that we've got a lot of oil that we can bring out of this place. So, and fracking just basically got rid of the whole peak oil debate. You know, so instead of having this thing, we have a nice little staircase thing, you know, where finally it just, we can, the economy can learn to live in this space here. We'll deal with the fact that hydrocarbons are just a little more expensive. Anyway, so, but of course flows limit stock formation, which means that once you have stocks that exist, you will search for ways to maintain those stocks alive through finding flows. And thus, the whole debate on SAFs, for example. Why are we debating SAFs? These synthetic aviation fuels? Well, we have a discussion, or green hydrogen. Why are we debating green hydrogen, which thermodynamically is crazy? Well, because we're trying to maintain these fossil-based assets that are adapted to hydrogen or to SAFs, what we call so-called drop-in fuels, right? A drop-in fuel means basically that this green thing that we create as a fuel can be dropped into the fossil fuel existing system without any changes. Okay. I guess, I didn't say it, but I guess you read it. By material structures, material stocks, we mean, you know, machines, infrastructures, the built environment. And I had a few graphs on that coming from. Finally, last important concept. So one, flows, second, stocks, third, the nexus. But this is our basic conceptual apparatus. We say that any social practice implies always at the same time stocks and flows. But also, from a metabolic point of view, any flow that we're analyzing implies practices and material stocks. And any stock that we're analyzing implies the two others. It's always the three together. They intermediate each other. And there we have, for me, once we use this framework, when it was first developed by the Vienna School, they limited social practice to practice theory, which is basically all about consumption and household habits. And one of the things that I worked with them was to enlarge the understanding to all forms of practice, including labor, investment, whatever, and to bring in power structures and institutions. So this framework is a truly integrated socio-ecological framework, because you can never ignore one part of the problem. You can never say, okay, I'm only focusing on this. What's the CO2 footprint of whatever? No, well, the CO2 footprint, well, let's look at this and this. And so anyway, I'll just skip that. It's just a neat little, okay. We, for comparative purposes, we work with the idea of metabolic regimes. These are really huge, and I want to have an idea of time. Okay, I'm still good on time? Yeah, okay. I'll go quickly through this because I want to get to the capitalism part, but for comparative purposes, we have 3 secular metabolic regimes, which is basically what the anthropologists work with all the time. We have hunter-gatherer societies, we have agrarian societies, and we have what we call fossil industrial societies. I guess the biggest thing for us, comparing agrarian, well, a fun fact, most of the concepts in economics were developed in an agrarian setting. So diminishing returns makes sense in an agrarian society. But it doesn't make sense that much in a fossil society for a bunch of reasons. But anyway, it's fun to know that Ricardo and Adam Smith were reasoning in a world where coal existed but wasn't really that important metabolically. So it's a fun fact to know and also Marx. The most important thing is that the surplus in a metabolic regime already exists. It's a question of absorbing it in the metabolism. And this is very different from an agrarian society where the whole issue is I plant a seed and I have to wait 1 year or 3 months. I plant it and I wait and I take care of it. And then I get my surplus. Whereas here, the minute I stick a pipe in the ground in an oil deposit, it's just coming out. And it's coming out like crazy, and it's coming out too fast. And the whole issue is how to slow it down. And then can I use it somehow? Or do I just flare it? 10 years ago, you have LNG now coming from the US in the past 6 years in Europe. 10 years ago, that methane was being torched in the back end and in the Permian fields. There was just no way to bring it anywhere, so you just torched it, burnt it, because we wanted the oil. So now it's LNG and it's coming here and it's powering your gas systems. But 5 years ago, it's just being burnt. So that's an example of this whole problem of the surplus form. Yeah, just one small last note from this, which means that fossil societies tend to have geological relations more than ecological relations, in the sense that we're interested in stuff we can extract from abiotic environments, much more than engaging with our biotic environments through ecological relations like agrarian societies and like primitive, so-called primitive hunter-gatherer societies. And we tend to consider biotic things like abiotic things. So tuna is brought down to as if it was just concrete or sand, or we exploit trees or tuna or animals as if they were abiotic things. We have that relationship to abiotic things also, to biotic things also. All right, this is what I want to get to grab. So just to show how, I guess, concretely in terms of economic modeling, the implications, you all know this thing. It's the circular flow of our factors of production on down here. And then we have our output there, and we can just stop there. And we call this the real economy, right? What's weird is that this place here produces, flour, it produces wood, it produces gravel. We don't know how it does. It's really magical, this thing that it can produce these factors that come up here, which are called land, which is the proxy for natural resources. And then on the other side, we have, to complete, we have the monetary flow, which is the opposite. And this is, this is what I learned back when I was doing my PhD with Boyer. We have a production norm, mass production. We have a consumption norm here. And then the feminists told us, hey, wait a minute, guys. We have to reproduce society also, and this is household work, this is care work, this is effective labor. So you have to open up your model a bit, and you have to integrate this whole huge sector, which is, half of the labor in society. So we added in the reproduction norm. We took the materialist feminist point of view and brought it into our models. And then we had a feminist expansion of real circulation, where we took into account non-paid labor. Fine. This is a pre-ecological model of our economy. There's no nature, there's no ecology, there's no materiality to this. This is all about human beings interacting with human beings. So we had to go from that model to this model, and this is the one that I propose in the book, where, of course, you have your middle here, productive and consumptive transformation. But we add to that extraction and dissipation as autonomous, independent moments of the economic process. That's the big thing. We don't reduce extraction to the functional needs of production. There is an autonomous pattern of investment in the extractive sector, which pushes into society materials that otherwise would not have been there. There's an autonomous process of accumulation at the point of dissipation of waste, which pulls out matter that might have stayed in society. The biggest example that we have here in Europe is your so-called waste to energy systems, which is just basically an incinerator. It's just basically burning garbage, but it's not called that, right? Veolia doesn't call it just incineration. It says, no, waste to energy. What is waste to energy doing? It's pulling matter outside of recycling streams. It's decircularizing matter that could have been in some form of circularity because it could have been reused in some way or another. It's pulling it towards the incinerator to create energy, supposedly green energy for your grid. So that's not a functional, it's not because we have plastics and paper and cardboard and bones and pieces of fish skin in our garbage that we need an incinerator. Because we could compost, we could recycle, we could reuse, etc. The incinerator is pulling that matter out. So that's, and I guess from a modeling point of view, that's the big challenge, is how to model these independent economic processes here that are institutional complexes. Of course, they're not only, and here. I guess that's the model I've been working with. We call it the ecologically expanded view of the economic process, and we usually draw it this way. Why? It goes back to this idea of entropy. Basically, we start with low entropy, high ecologically valuable materials, and we end up with high entropy, low ecologically valuable waste. So yeah, I won't comment that more. And this is what this graph kind of shows you, and this is an interesting way to put it. The first thing is that you say, in a capitalist society, there is a relationship between value and entropy, but we don't reduce value to entropy, which some economists have tried to do, and it doesn't work. We just say there is a relation. And there's two zones of impossibility. In a capitalist society, you cannot have, that's obvious, value without entropic transformations. I mean, we talk a bit, some people talk about immaterial accumulation, the immaterial economy, but I mean, look at right now in southern US, households are seeing their energy prices spike because of AI. And why? Because the AI demands huge amounts of energy. So what is the most immaterial, supposedly dematerialized intelligence, implies restarting coal-fired power plants that have been shut down. And now we're thinking about tying power centers to nuclear plants and building up nuclear energy to do this. So no value without entropy. And in a capitalist society, we can't, so entropic transformation is negative. The positive is biophysical work, right? To have biophysical, if you have biophysical work in one form or another, salt, melting, ice is biophysical work. If you have biophysical work, you have entropy. The salt is dissolving. The energy needed to create the salt crystal will be lost in this process. And you won't, anyways, you can calculate that loss, and that's entropy. So no biophysical work, we can't access biophysical work without, in some form or another, engaging in capitalist valorization, because we live in a capitalist society. So, and then once we've done that, then we can just map out, the way things, so we have a valorization process, and then realization process we call consumption, and then a waste process, which is a cost to value. It's a process of devalorization. So that's just a way of representing. And then I guess I'm towards the end of my talk. So I work with, when I work with this, I work coming from post-Keynesian economics. I'm interested in, my daily work is working on oil and gas and forestry corporations, usually multinationals, and trying to understand how they're developing and why, and helping environmental groups on these issues. I also work on some industries that transform matter, like the automobile industry or the construction industry. So my theory of capitalism is one where I have these huge monopolistic corporations, under these you have a myriad of small businesses which are usually in a monopsonic or monopsonic capture. They produce exclusively for that, or they sell exclusively the products from the big. And there's specifics that I can get into on what a monopolistic corporation does to the economy, but one big thing is it does everything it can to protect its fixed capital. It'll do everything it can to protect that fixed capital. Fixed capital comes in two forms: immaterial, which is patents, knowledge, branding, marketing, and then material fixed capital, which is the material stocks I've been discussing since the beginning of my talk: the factories, the refineries, the pipelines, the mines, the tractors, whatever. So we know from heterodox theory that production is organized around monopolistic rents. There's a tendency to overproduce. Overproduction is important. It's a barrier of entry to keep the small guys out. We actively manage the devalorization of our capital, so we manage the introduction of innovations to protect our fixed capital. Innovation doesn't just happen. I know there's a very charismatic prof that teaches this in France, that innovation just happens, and firms like, oh my God, wow, creative destruction hits again. No, in real life, it doesn't work that way. These things are planned 15, 20 years in advance. You don't just pop in innovations. You do everything to manage the innovation process to protect your monopolistic position. If you've worked on real businesses, you know they do that, and they spend a lot of money doing it, and they can even hire you to help them do it, and they'll pay you tons of money to do this. So it's innovation in real life. So you build up organizational capacity to manage the devalorization of your capital, either physical or social. And finally, you want to have minimum production levels to protect your sunk costs. And if you have profits, great. If you don't have profits, as long as you can reproduce the business, keep it going, we call it a going concern, then things are good. And then on the other side, consumption, well, our theory of consumption has nothing to do with what neoclassical economists talk about. So you have the concept of consumption norm that comes here from France, from regulation theory, norme de consommation. So it's conditioned by a sales effort. We have this concept of provisioning systems, or very complex integrated systems to bring a given service to the end user. And we know that mass consumption answers a problem, which is overproduction. So we overconsume what we overproduce, and that's what the economy's been doing since the 1920s. Because in the 1920s, we discovered that if we just overproduce and not overconsume, we'll have a problem, which is called a depression. So that's something that's kind of all organized, and we know this is basic post-Keynesian economics. So what we've tried to do is to say, okay, what does this mean? This is my second last slide. What does this mean for extractive processes? And I won't get into all the detail, but you can see it in the book. But we have something very, a bit. There's a capitalist pressure to extract. Extractive corporations must extract a minimum level of stuff to be viable and to protect their business model. The problem is that the way to cheapen extraction, the best way, the easiest way to cheapen extraction is to cheapen delivery of the extracted raw material. Invest in ports, invest in bigger ships, invest in railroads, invest in pipelines. The thing is, the more you grow your capacity to put into movement, to circulate raw materials, the more you have to put some in. So your unit costs go down, which is great, which is fun. You're making more money because your unit cost of a ton of steel, of a ton of oil, of a ton of coal, of a ton of trees goes down because your capacity to circulate it, you get economies of scale and whatever. The problem is that your minimum keeps creeping up. So you're caught in a treadmill where you're bringing down your costs and you're bringing up the amount that you have to put into circulation. And that has a huge impact on the productive systems. The productive systems are confronted continuously with more and more raw materials that are cheaper and cheaper. So this creates, so you might have laboratories, researching efficiency in this material and how can we become better at this and better at that. Fine, that's an incentive to invest in more efficient systems. But then you look there at your suppliers and you're, holy shit, they're burying me in coal and oil and gas and so much, and it's dirt cheap. Why should I keep these guys in the lab working when I've got this free stuff coming in? So that's one thing that we've noticed concretely looking at doing the research. And we also, and then the surplus that accumulates at the point of extraction, the capital that is accumulated by extractive corporations doesn't go to the productive economy. It stays in the extractive sector and it's reinvested in what we call expansion frontiers, which is how can I find more stuff to extract in one form or another. So there is a growth drivers which are specific to extraction. And we have the same, and I won't get into it, but we have exactly the same thing at the point of dissipation, where we have growth drivers specific to that basically are telling this part of the economy, hey, bring it in, bring it on. Don't be efficient, please don't. Bring on all the material you want. The more you bring in, the more we can transform and sink. And the example I just gave was if you're building up a waste to energy plant, which is millions in investment, and it's going to run for at least 30 years, you got to guarantee that you can throw stuff into it for the next 30 years. So there's no incentive to reduce the amount of waste in society. On the contrary, you need the waste, otherwise you lose the money in that. And since it's a private-public partnership, or since your investment fund is probably invested in this thing, you want it to go. You want it to keep going. So I guess that's the kind of things we see with this model that you don't see with the model I had before. Because you have a functionalist understanding of production, of extraction and dissipation. Okay, I wanted to stop with concluding thoughts, and then I can hand over to you guys. Did I have anything? Concluding remarks was this. I guess just kind of yeah, well, it's just basically, summarizing what I had said. So the epistemological principles, social metabolism is not a metaphor. It's a real concept. First thing, it's not just like a body, an economy. No, it's a real concept. To have what we call a dialectical, a non-reductionist understanding of biophysical and socio-economic processes. They're coupled, but they're not the same. We don't reduce one to the other, always, which means we have room for both types of scientific analysis. We need the biologist beside the economist. We don't subsume one to the other. And then we have this model of what we call the ecologically expanded economic process. So go back to Polanyi. So we have a double embeddedness, social and ecological, which gives us a possibility for a real ecologically grounded comparative or critical political economy. Otherwise, nature is just out there. It's just a concept. We say, oh, capitalism has consequences on nature. It's not, but nature is internal to the process. And then what I showed you was, I do a lot of this meso-analysis of corporate oligopolistic, I'm used to saying this in French, champ oligopolistic fields. I was an Anglophone until 12, and then at 12 I started to become Francophone. And so I lost my English when I was around, my French when I was around 9, and now I hear myself speaking with a French accent in English. It's weird, and anyway, so. Yeah, but that's important. You can look at oligopolistic fields, and that's very, like I use this for the oil and gas sector. We have, I think, a much more robust understanding of what extractivism is. We have good definitions of extractivism coming from anthropologists, from philosophers, also from political economists that understand it in terms of international trade. What we lack is an economic understanding of extraction as a sector in the economy and its specific constraints. And I gave a few examples of those. And what I gave were just basic starting examples. I mean, I think there's so much work to do, and I don't have a complete theory of this. I've got a limited understanding, and it's really an expanding field. And then also, the one thing that I think now a lot of us are interested in looking at plantation capitalism to look at the production of biomass, because I think it's a different mode of organization, and I think it'll need different forms of analysis. But that's just, yeah, it's kind of the thing that I want to get into eventually. I'll be looking at boreal forest plantation as a specific, but we could look at palm oil, which is, I guess, big. And there, I've done what I've wanted to do. Thank you.